Iran's oil is sitting in tankers that have nowhere to go. Its storage capacity fills up in 2 weeks, and when it does, the regime will be forced to shut down its own oil wells, permanently losing extraction capacity it can never recover. The clock started this morning, and Iran knows it. At a.m. Eastern Time on April 14th, U.S. Central Command officially began enforcing a naval blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports. The announcement was precise. The blockade applies to vessels of all nations heading to or departing from Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz between non-Iranian ports are free to pass. If you're heading to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or the way, you're fine. If you're heading to Iran, you're turning around. President Trump had framed this more broadly before the announcement, calling it a complete blockade, all or none. CENTCOM's official scope was narrower, but the practical impact on Iran is the same. Everything that keeps the Iranian economy alive moves through the sea, and as of this morning, that pipeline is cut. Here's what that actually means in numbers. Iran exports approximately $270 million worth of goods every day. Around $140 million of that is crude oil. The remaining $80 million covers petrochemicals, minerals, steel, and metals. All of it moves by sea. On the import side, Iran brought in roughly $58 billion in goods last year, about $160 million per day, covering everything from consumer products to the raw materials that keep Iranian factories operational. All of that is now at risk. Run the numbers on the export side alone. Iran stands to lose approximately $8 billion every single month. That is not a rounding error. That is an economy-halting figure. And on the import side, when raw materials stop arriving, factories run out of inputs, production stops, jobs disappear, and in a country already sitting on years of accumulated economic frustration, that creates something the Iranian regime has faced before and barely survived. The protests that shook Iran in recent years did not begin as political revolts, they began as economic protests. People were angry about mismanagement, rising prices, shortages, and a government that appeared indifferent to their suffering. Those protests escalated into something the regime only survived through brutal suppression. The underlying economic conditions that ignited them never went away, they worsened, and now, with this blockade, they are about to become catastrophically worse. But the most urgent threat to the regime isn't the immediate export loss, it's the oil storage problem. Iran has roughly 50–60 million barrels of total storage capacity across its oil depots. Approximately 60% of that capacity is already occupied. That leaves around 20 million barrels of usable space. Iran produces roughly 1.5 million barrels of crude oil per day. Do the math. In approximately 2 weeks, Iran's spare storage capacity is completely full. At that point, oil companies have no choice but to begin shutting down wells. And every time you shut down an oil well, you permanently lose between 5 and 10% of its extraction capacity. That revenue is gone forever from a regime that is already desperate for it. This is not a theoretical future crisis. This is a ticking clock, and the regime understands exactly what it means. Iran's official response has been a combination of legal challenge, military warning, and pointed irony. Iran's military spokesperson declared the blockade illegal under international law. The Parliamentary National Security Commission called it a bluff. Commission spokesperson Ibrahim Rezai wrote publicly that the move constitutes an act of war and warned that Iran has cards it has not yet played. He told Trump to accept defeat and not demand at the negotiating table what he failed to achieve through military force. That is extraordinary language. But consider the source. This is the same regime that spent months attacking civilian shipping from countries that had nothing to do with this conflict. A Thai-flagged civilian vessel was attacked by the URG, Thailand, a country on the other side of the world with no involvement in the conflict. Iran was effectively running a maritime extortion operation, charging vessels up to $2 million in transit fees just to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that under international law belongs to everyone. A lawmaker on Iran's own Parliamentary Security Committee confirmed these toll fees to NPR. They were real, they were significant, and they were legally indefensible. So when Iranian officials call the U.S. blockade piracy and an illegal act of war, the response writes itself. Iran's armed forces went further. The URG warned that any military vessel approaching the strait will be considered a ceasefire violation and met with severe force. Iran's acting defense minister announced the country's armed forces were on maximum combat alert, and yet, despite all of this, the ceasefire is technically still holding. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif confirmed on Monday that the ceasefire remained in place and that diplomatic efforts were continuing. The dialogue has not collapsed, not yet. What the blockade actually looks like in practice is worth examining closely, because enforcing a naval interdiction in one of the world's most congested shipping lanes is not a simple operation. According to ship tracking data from Clapeler, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had already dropped sharply before the blockade officially began. Vessels were steering clear. One previously sanctioned tanker registered in Comoros, named Elpis, was identified passing through the strait after the blockade took effect. A Botswana-registered tanker called Austria reportedly turned around 41 minutes after Trump's deadline, redirecting from Oman to the way. Another vessel, Rich Sterry, began broadcasting a drifting status off the coast of Kesham Island, apparently stalling and waiting for clarity on what happens next. According to NBC News, 31 vessels passed through the strait in the 24 hours before the blockade went into effect, compared to normal traffic volumes that run considerably higher. Of those, 6 were carrying cargo oil, chemical products, or liquefied petroleum gas. The rest were sailing light or their load status was unknown. Legal experts are watching the enforcement dimension carefully. According to Todd Huntley, a retired Navy captain and director of Georgetown University's National Security Law program, the legality of the blockade depends entirely on how it's carried out. International law requires that any blockade be officially declared, enforced impartially against all nations, and that humanitarian goods including food and medicine must be allowed through. CENTCOM issued formal notices to mariners before the blockade began, suggesting awareness of these requirements. But as Andreas Krieg, a senior lecturer at King's College London's School of Security Studies, told NBC News, this looks less like a clean historical blockade and more like a complex, high-risk interdiction operation, requiring U.S. naval forces to identify, track, hail, divert, and potentially board vessels across one of the most crowded shipping lanes on Earth. The military assets deployed to enforce it are substantial. According to CBS News, CENTCOM currently has the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, 11 destroyers, and the USS Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group operating in the Middle East. The USS Gerald Ford and additional destroyers are in the Mediterranean. On Saturday, as reported by the New York Times, U.S. naval vessels had already entered the strait to clear mines previously laid by the a necessary precondition for any serious enforcement operation. Trump, speaking outside the Oval Office on Monday, offered his own assessment of Iran's degraded naval capability. Their whole navy is underwater. 158 ships are gone. Their navy is gone. Most of their mine droppers are gone. Whether every detail of that claim is precise, the strategic picture is clear. Iran's ability to directly challenge the blockade militarily is severely limited compared to where it stood before February 28. But Iran has other leverage, and one of the most dangerous involves a body of water that hasn't received enough attention in Western coverage of this conflict. Iranian officials have begun explicitly threatening to escalate to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Bab el-Mandeb sits at the southern end of the Red Sea, connecting it to the Gulf of Aden. In terms of global commerce, it is nearly as important as the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the oil that once moved through Hormuz has been rerouted through the Red Sea and past the Bab el-Mandeb to reach Asian markets. Just north of the Red Sea sits the Suez Canal, the artery connecting Asian trade to European markets. Any sustained disruption at the Bab el-Mandeb sends shockwaves through global supply chains. This is not a hypothetical threat. Iran controls the Houthis in Yemen. Last year, the Houthis launched an extended campaign of missile and drone attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea that lasted months and required a sustained combined air campaign to push back. They can do it again if Tehran orders it. As one analyst put it during a live CNN broadcast, it's a major concern that the Iranians may direct the Houthis to launch missiles or drones at vessels in the Red Sea. Deterring that threat a second time while simultaneously enforcing a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz would stretch U.S. and allied naval resources significantly. This is part of Tehran's calculation. Now let's talk about the factor that most Western coverage is underweighting. China. Almost all of Iran's oil exports flow to China. This accounts for roughly 11 to 13% of total Chinese oil imports. If you factor in shadow fleet arrangements that officially don't exist but clearly do, the number may be higher. But Iran isn't China's only concern in this waterway. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the Way, Oman, and Kuwait all ship their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Add Russia's roughly 20% share of Chinese imports, and you're looking at approximately 50% of China's entire oil supply flowing through or from the Gulf region. All of that depends on the strait remaining open, and who effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Iran did, not the United States. CENTCOM has been explicit. The blockade only targets ships bound for Iranian ports. Every other vessel heading to Gulf destinations is free to move. The disruption to broader Gulf shipping is entirely of Iran's making, because Iran closed the strait, laid mines, and began charging transit tolls. That places China in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. We know from reporting last week that Beijing had already applied quiet pressure on Iran, helping to broker the Islamabad talks that took place over the weekend. China needs this conflict to de-escalate. It needs the strait open. It needs Iranian oil, but more critically, it needs Gulf oil. And right now, it's getting neither reliably. Every day the disruption continues. China's energy security deteriorates a little further. The expectation in Washington, according to sources familiar with U.S. strategy, is that Beijing will increase this pressure. The Islamabad talks themselves deserve a close look, because what happened inside that conference room reveals how close and how far the two sides actually are. Vice President J.D. Vance led the U.S. delegation. Iran's chief negotiator was Mohammad Baker Kalibaf, Speaker of Iran's parliament, a delegation reportedly numbering around 100 officials, 21 hours of talks, and no deal. According to U.S. officials cited by ABC News, the 6 core American conditions presented by Vance were: 1. Iran must end all uranium enrichment. 2. All major enrichment facilities must be dismantled. 3. All highly enriched material must be retrieved. 4. A fully reopened Strait of Hormuz with no tolls. 5. A broader regional peace framework including Gulf allies. 6. An end to funding of proxy forces including Hezbollah and the Houthis. Notably absent was any condition on Iran's ballistic missile program, which appears to have been quietly set aside to preserve the possibility of a deal. The U.S. was also reportedly seeking a 20-year freeze on all Iranian nuclear enrichment activities. Despite the public posturing, Iranian officials were reportedly willing to discuss the nuclear issue, but the gaps remained enormous, and a structural problem emerged that revealed just how fragile Iran's negotiating position really is. The person with actual authority to say yes was not in the room. Vance himself confirmed this. During the 21-hour session, he called President Trump approximately half a dozen times, possibly more. The Iranian delegation, however, was afraid to make a similar call back to Tehran. They were worried about interception. They were concerned that an intelligence agency might track the call. So, Iran showed up with 100 officials, and none of them had the authority to close a deal. This tells us two things. First, the Iranian regime is so fragmented and so deeply paranoid that it could not conduct secure communications during the most consequential diplomatic moment it has faced in years. The gap between Iran's public assertiveness and its internal dysfunction is wider than most observers recognize. Second, the negotiating process is not over. Iran's delegation took the American proposals back to Tehran. Whoever holds actual decision-making authority, Supreme Leader Khamenei, ERG commanders, or some combination, is now sitting with those terms. They can accept, reject, or counter, and if that counter is anywhere within the range of what Washington will accept, a deal remains possible. Vance, speaking on Fox News on Monday, was deliberate with his framing. He told Brett Baier that the ball is in Iran's court and that it was up to Tehran whether there would be further direct talks. Trump, despite announcing the blockade, told reporters outside the Oval Office that Iran wants to make a peace deal very badly. Announcing a blockade while saying the other side desperately wants peace is a precise encapsulation of the high-stakes game being played right now. The talks in Islamabad broke down specifically over 3 issues. Iran would not concede on ending uranium enrichment, would not agree to dismantle enrichment facilities, and refused to fully reopen the strait without conditions. The tolling regime Iran had imposed on shipping was precisely the flashpoint that collapsed the negotiations, according to a U.S. official speaking to ABC News. Israel was fully supportive of the blockade decision. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed in a cabinet statement that Israel is in complete coordination with Washington and endorsed the move as a direct consequence of Iran violating the ceasefire framework. On the international side, French President Emmanuel Macron announced preparations for a peaceful multinational mission aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the strait. He confirmed he would be convening a joint conference with the United Kingdom in the coming days. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is already engaged on the energy cost dimension because Europe is bleeding. According to Gulf News, the EU energy crisis triggered by the Iran war has already cost the 27-nation bloc more than €22 billion in higher fossil fuel bills. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that Brussels will present emergency energy plans the following week. According to Reuters, Brent crude has risen approximately 40% since the war began on February 28, with prices nearing or surpassing $100 per barrel. Before this war, Brent was sitting around $70. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright acknowledged at the Semaphore World Economy Conference on Monday that oil prices will likely continue rising until meaningful ship traffic gets through the blockaded strait, and that peak pricing could occur within the next few weeks. The pain at the pump is not over, Iran's parliamentary speaker Kalibaf seemed to relish making this point publicly, posting a photo of a U.S. gas station price sign on social media with the caption, "Enjoy the current pump figures with the so-called blockade. Soon you'll be nostalgic for $4 to $5 gas." A remarkable thing to broadcast publicly, even by the standards of this conflict. Beyond oil and gas, the strait is a major corridor for fertilizer, aluminum, and helium shipments. The economic ripple effects touch agriculture, manufacturing, and technology sectors globally. Spain's defense minister Margarita Robles called the blockade another step in an escalating crisis, Secretary General Guterres stated bluntly through his spokesman Dujarric that there is no military solution and called on both parties to maintain the ceasefire and pursue dialogue. Even Russia expressed concern. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov warned that the blockade will continue negatively impacting international markets. Coming from Moscow, that is about as close to genuine alarm as diplomatic language allows. But here is the reality that all of this leads to. Iran is the country running out of time. The United States has assembled one of the most powerful naval forces ever deployed in the Middle East. The blockade is live. Iranian oil exports are effectively frozen. Storage capacity fills up in approximately 2 weeks, at which point well shutdowns begin causing permanent, irreversible economic damage to a regime that is already struggling. Domestic economic pressure is building. The memory of protests that nearly toppled the government is not distant from anyone in Tehran. At the same time, the diplomatic window has not closed. The ceasefire, however fragile, is technically still holding. Pakistan is still mediating. China is applying pressure from the sidelines. Iran's delegation in Islamabad was, according to U.S. officials, genuinely willing to engage on the nuclear question. The framework for a deal exists. The gaps are real but not impossible. The next 72 hours are decisive. Iran can choose escalation, activate the Houthis, threaten Gulf shipping, attempt to challenge the blockade. Directly, that path leads somewhere very dark and very costly for everyone involved, including the regime. Or Iran can make the calculation that its position deteriorates by the hour, that its economic clock is louder than its military threats, and that the time to negotiate while it still has something left to negotiate with is right now. The question is whether whoever holds real power in Tehran understands what the numbers are telling them as clearly as everyone on the outside can read them.